Dr. Elizabeth Harper's latex gloves froze mid-incision, her scalpel suspended 3 inches above the gaping wound as her eyes widened behind surgical glasses. The steady beep of monitors filled the operating room's absolute silence. It wasn't the benign cyst they'd expected to find inside 74-year-old William Anderson's neck growth. A surgical nurse stumbled backward, her instrument tray clattering to the sterile floor as metallic objects scattered across white tiles. The anesthesiologist's hands trembled as he checked Anderson's vitals twice, unable to process what lay exposed before them. William had carried this secret for 45 years, teaching 3 generations of high school students mathematics, never knowing their beloved teacher harbored something impossible beneath his carefully positioned baseball caps. The man who'd coached varsity basketball and volunteered at soup kitchens had been hiding evidence of a life nobody could imagine. "Dear God, Doctor," Harper whispered, backing away from the table. "How is this even possible?" What had William Anderson been concealing all these years, and why was it surfacing now? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, William "Bill" Anderson had perfected the art of invisibility in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. At 74, the retired Maple Grove High School math teacher had transformed from the man who once led the annual homecoming parade into someone who slipped through shadows, timing his grocery runs for the empty hours just after dawn. The split-level house on Cedar Street, where he'd lived for 35 years with his late wife Margaret, had become his fortress. Paint peeled from the shutters like old skin, and the vegetable garden Margaret had tended with such pride now grew wild and untamed. Bill preferred it that way. Less attention meant fewer questions about why the man who'd once been voted Teacher of the Year 3 times now wore baseball caps even in the sweltering Minnesota summers. The lump had started innocently enough, a small bump behind his left ear that he'd dismissed as another indignity of aging. "Getting old ain't for sissies," he'd mutter to Margaret's photograph each morning, the same phrase his grandmother had used when Bill was young and thought 70 seemed impossibly ancient. But as months turned to years, the growth had developed a mind of its own, expanding like a secret that refused to stay buried. Bill's days followed a rigid pattern designed to avoid human contact. Morning coffee with Margaret's picture, where he'd update her on the weather and the stray cats that had claimed his back porch. Afternoon game shows that reminded him of simpler times when other people's problems seemed manageable. Evening phone calls that never came from a son who'd built a life 2,000 miles away and seemed content to keep it that way. Michael Anderson, his only child, was 45 and thriving as an FBI behavioral analyst in Washington, D.C. Their relationship had cooled to obligatory holiday cards and birthday phone calls that grew shorter each year. He'd stopped visiting after Margaret's funeral 3 years ago, claiming work demanded his attention. Bill suspected the truth was more complicated, that his grief made Michael uncomfortable, that his small-town life felt suffocating to someone who profiled serial killers and attended federal briefings. The financial reality of his situation gnawed at Bill like a persistent ache. His teacher's pension covered the basics, but Medicare's gaps felt like canyons when facing potential medical bills. The house, nearly paid off after decades of careful budgeting, represented his only real security. He'd rather suffer in silence than risk losing the home where he'd graded thousands of algebra tests and nursed Margaret through her final illness. Neighbor Martha Thompson, the only person who still attempted regular contact, had grown increasingly suspicious of Bill's hermit-like behavior. "Bill Anderson, when's the last time you came to church?" she'd call through the screen door. "Pastor Williams asks about you every Sunday." But Bill had perfected the art of being perpetually under the weather or just heading out whenever Martha appeared with casseroles and concerned expressions. What Martha couldn't see, what nobody could see, was how Bill's simple morning routine had become an exercise in careful positioning and the growing certainty that whatever was growing beneath his skin carried secrets far deeper than anyone could imagine. The mandatory Medicare enrollment meeting at Maple Grove Community Center arrived like a summons Bill couldn't ignore. For weeks he'd thrown away the notices, but the final letter carried the weight of federal requirement: attend or lose benefits. At 74, with a teacher's pension that barely covered utilities, Bill couldn't afford to play games with his health care coverage. He spent an hour in front of his bedroom mirror, arranging and rearranging the Minnesota Twins baseball cap that had become his armor. The lump, now roughly the size of a tennis ball, had developed its own geography, peaks and valleys that defied concealment. No matter how he positioned the fabric, something seemed wrong, asymmetrical, obvious to anyone who looked closely. The community center buzzed with the familiar faces of Maple Grove's elderly population, people who remembered Bill as the dedicated teacher who'd helped their grandchildren pass algebra. He chose a seat in the back corner, pulling his cap lower over his eyes, praying to get through the presentation without incident. Halfway through the Medicare representative's explanation of Part D coverage, Bill felt the warm wetness against his neck. The lump had begun to weep, a thin, clear fluid that had started appearing over the past month. He pressed his hand to the cap, feeling the moisture seep through the fabric. "Mr. Anderson." The voice belonged to Janet Mills, whose son had been in Bill's 1995 advanced placement class. "Are you feeling all right? You look pale." Bill forced a smile, keeping his hand pressed against his neck. "Just a little warm in here, dear. All these people, you know." But as he spoke, he felt more fluid, and the metallic scent that had been haunting him for weeks seemed stronger. The cap, once navy blue, was darkening with moisture that wasn't sweat. Bill excused himself and hurried toward the restroom, but the damage was spreading faster than he could walk. By the time he reached the hallway, the fabric had turned crimson. "Oh, my Lord," gasped Betty Whitman, the church organist. "Bill, you're bleeding!" The hallway erupted in concerned voices. "Someone call 911. Get him a chair. What is that thing?" The last comment, whispered but audible, sent ice through Bill's veins. He pulled the cap tighter, but it was useless now. The secret he'd hidden for 6 years was bleeding through his fingers. Bill ran through the community center doors, across the parking lot and down Cedar Street toward home, leaving behind a room full of shocked neighbors and a blood-stained tile floor. Behind him, he could hear Martha Thompson's voice calling his name, but Bill didn't stop until he reached his front door, fumbled with the lock, and collapsed inside his hallway. For 3 days, Bill refused to answer his door or his phone. He survived on crackers and water, too ashamed to face the world, too frightened to seek help. The bleeding had stopped, but the humiliation felt permanent. Everyone would know now. Everyone would talk. On the 4th day, Martha Thompson made the call Bill had been dreading. "Michael, it's Martha, your father's neighbor. Son, you need to come home. Something's wrong with Bill, and I don't think he's got much time to argue about it." Michael Anderson was in the middle of a federal task force briefing about domestic terrorism patterns when his phone rang. He almost ignored it. Minnesota area code meant it wasn't work, but something made him excuse himself and take the call. 26 hours later, he stood on his childhood front porch using the key Bill had hidden under the same ceramic frog for 30 years. The house smelled stale, closed up like grief that had settled into the furniture. He found his father in Margaret's old recliner, wearing a bathrobe at 3 in the afternoon, the television playing to an empty room. "Dad?" The man who turned toward him was barely recognizable. Bill had always been proud of his appearance. Pressed shirts for grocery shopping, clean-shaven every morning, the kind of man who believed in maintaining standards. This person was hollow-eyed, rail-thin, and wearing a baseball cap indoors in October. "You didn't need to come," Bill said, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who'd fought a battle too long alone. "Martha had no right to call you." Michael pulled up Margaret's old ottoman and sat facing his father for the first time in 2 years. The distance between them felt measured in more than miles, in phone calls that grew shorter, visits that grew rarer, in the gradual way grief had carved canyons between people who once shared everything. "Dad, when's the last time you ate a real meal?" "This house." He gestured around the living room where dust-covered family photographs and newspapers dated from weeks ago sat unread. "This isn't living. This is dying in slow motion." Bill's hand went instinctively to his neck, adjusting the cap. "I've managed fine for 74 years without your help, Michael. I don't need charity from my own son. Look at yourself. When's the last time you looked in a mirror?" The silence stretched between them until Bill finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I haven't looked at myself, really looked, in 6 years." The confrontation between father and son reached its breaking point when Michael gently reached toward Bill's baseball cap. Bill recoiled as if he'd been struck, pressing himself deeper into Margaret's recliner. "Don't," he whispered, his voice carrying decades of shame. "Please, don't." But Michael had seen enough. The way his father protected his neck, the blood-stained cap he'd worn for days, the fear in his eyes when anyone came too close. "Dad, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. How long has this been going on?" Bill's composure finally cracked. Tears he'd held back for months spilled down his cheeks as he slowly pulled the cap away, revealing the mass that had consumed the left side of his neck. Michael didn't flinch, though Bill saw his jaw tighten and his hands clench into fists. 6 years, Bill whispered. "Maybe a little more. It started small, just a little bump. I thought—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence about getting old, about accepting decline, about being too proud and too poor to face reality. Michael was already reaching for his phone. "We're going to the doctor today. Right now." "Michael, honey, you don't understand the money. I don't care about the money." His voice was sharp with frustration and fear. "Dad, this thing is bigger than a softball. How have you been living with this?" The drive to Dr. Patricia Reynolds' office passed in silence. Bill sat rigidly in the passenger seat of Michael's rental car, watching familiar neighborhoods blur past. Every turn brought them closer to a reckoning he'd avoided for years. When they pulled into the medical center parking lot, Bill made one last attempt at retreat. "I can't afford this, Michael. Medicare doesn't cover everything, and I won't burden you with—" "Stop." Michael turned off the engine and faced his father. "Just stop. We'll figure out the money." "We'll figure out everything, but we're not driving home until someone explains what's happening to you." Dr. Reynolds had been the Anderson family physician for 20 years, the woman who'd delivered Michael and guided Margaret through her final illness. When Bill removed his cap in her examination room, even her professional composure wavered. "Bill," she said softly, pulling on latex gloves, "this should have been addressed years ago. Why didn't you come to me?" The examination was thorough and uncomfortable. Dr. Reynolds' gentle probing revealed that the mass was firm, irregular, and had developed its own network of blood vessels. When she pressed certain areas, Bill winced, admitting to pain he'd been managing with over-the-counter medications and sheer stubbornness. "The size and complexity of this growth puts you at serious risk," Dr. Reynolds explained, her words measured and careful. "Infection, hemorrhage, possible malignancy. Bill, this needs immediate surgical intervention." "What kind of surgery?" Michael asked, when his father remained silent. "This is beyond my expertise. I'm referring you to Dr. Elizabeth Harper at Regional Medical Center. She's the chief of neurosurgery, specializes in complex cases." Dr. Reynolds was already writing the referral, her pen scratching across prescription paper with urgent efficiency. "I'm calling ahead to expedite the appointment." The financial reality hit Bill like cold water. "Doctor, I need to know what this will cost. I live on a fixed income, and I can't—" Dr. Reynolds interrupted him gently. "Bill, we're past the point of financial considerations. Without treatment, this condition could be life-threatening. Let's focus on getting you healthy, and we'll work out the details afterward." But Bill knew better. He'd seen too many elderly neighbors face the choice between medication and groceries, between necessary procedures and keeping their homes. Medicare Part B covered 80% of approved procedures, but 20% of major surgery could easily reach thousands of dollars. Money he simply didn't have. That evening, while Bill rested in his bedroom, Michael explored the house he'd grown up in but hadn't really seen in years. What he discovered broke his heart. In the kitchen, he found a pill organizer with compartments labeled for 7 days, but only every other day was filled. Bill had been rationing his heart medication. In the study, he found a shoebox filled with medical bills he'd been ignoring, collection notices for a mammogram from 2 years ago, and letters from specialists he'd never seen. The financial pressure had been building for years, and his father had chosen suffering and silence over asking for help. The most devastating discovery came when Michael was looking for Bill's insurance cards. Hidden in the bedroom closet underneath Margaret's wedding dress and his father's old teaching awards, Michael found a manila envelope containing $50,000 in cash, Bill's emergency fund, saved penny by penny from his teacher's pension. He had the money for surgery, but had been hoarding it like a lifeline, terrified that spending it would leave him destitute. When Michael confronted his father about the hidden money, Bill's response revealed the depth of his fear. "That money is all that stands between me and the county nursing home," he said quietly. "If I spend it on surgery and something else happens, if I can't take care of myself anymore, what then? Medicare doesn't pay for long-term care, Michael. That money might be the difference between dying in my own bed and dying among strangers." The conversation that followed stretched deep into the night. Michael learned about the daily calculations his father made, choosing between air conditioning and groceries during hot summers, delaying dental work, driving a car with bald tires because new ones cost $400 he couldn't spare. "Why didn't you tell me?" Michael asked, his voice thick with guilt. "All these years, why didn't you ask for help?" Bill's answer cut to the heart of their relationship. "Because you built a life without me in it, son. You call on Christmas and my birthday. You haven't visited since your mother's funeral. What was I supposed to think? That you wanted to hear about my problems?" The truth hung between them. Michael had been so focused on escaping Maple Grove's limitations that he'd abandoned the man who'd sacrificed everything to give him opportunities Bill had never had. The regional medical center loomed over Maple Grove like a modern cathedral, all glass and steel that made Bill feel small and out of place. He'd dressed in his best Sunday outfit, a navy dress shirt Margaret had always complimented, the tie he'd worn to parent-teacher conferences, and the dreaded baseball cap arranged with military precision. Michael walked beside him through the automatic doors, carrying a folder thick with insurance papers and the weight of 2 years' worth of guilt. Dr. Elizabeth Harper's office occupied a corner of the surgical wing, its walls lined with diplomas and awards that spoke to decades of medical excellence. When the doctor entered, Bill felt an odd sense of familiarity, though he couldn't place why. Dr. Harper was perhaps 52, with graying brown hair pulled back efficiently and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Anderson," Dr. Harper said, extending her hand with professional warmth, "Dr. Reynolds has briefed me on your case. Before we begin the examination, I need to understand the timeline. When did you first notice this growth?" Bill's hands twisted in his lap. About 6 years ago, maybe a little longer. It started so small, I thought it was just, aging. And it's grown consistently over that period? Yes, but slowly at first. The last year it's been— Bill touched the cap self-consciously. More aggressive. Dr. Harper made notes, her pen scratching across the chart. Any family history of tumors, cysts, or unusual growths? No, nothing like this? Bill paused, then added quietly, though I suppose there are things about family history I might not know. Something in Bill's tone made Dr. Harper look up sharply, but she continued with her questions. Any history of head trauma, accidents, falls, anything that might have caused injury to that area? Bill's breath caught almost imperceptibly. No, I mean, nothing serious. Everyone has little bumps and bruises over the years. Michael noticed his father's hesitation but said nothing. He'd learned that pushing Bill too hard only made him retreat further into himself. Mr. Anderson, I'm going to need to examine the area now. I know this is uncomfortable, but I need to see what we're dealing with. Bill's hands trembled as he removed the cap. Dr. Harper's professional composure never wavered, though Michael saw her blink twice when the full extent of the growth was revealed. The mass dominated the left side of Bill's neck and had begun to distort the shape of his jaw. The skin was stretched tight, with visible blood vessels creating a web-like pattern across its surface. "How long since you've been able to sleep comfortably?" Dr. Harper asked, gently palpating the edges of the growth. "I sleep in Margaret's recliner mostly. Lying flat makes it difficult." The examination was thorough and professional, but Bill could see concern growing in Dr. Harper's expression. When the doctor stepped back, her diagnosis was frank. "Mr. Anderson, this appears to be a complex cyst that has developed its own blood supply and possibly attached to surrounding tissue. The size and location make this a serious surgical case. We'll need MRI imaging to understand the full extent before planning an approach." "What kind of surgery?" Michael asked. "Major surgery. This will require a full surgical team, possibly 6 to 8 hours, and extended recovery time. I won't lie to you. There are risks. The growth is close to major blood vessels and nerve pathways." Bill felt the room spinning slightly. "And the cost?" Dr. Harper consulted her computer. "With your Medicare coverage, your out-of-pocket expense should be around $4,000, assuming no complications." $4,000. Bill's emergency fund could cover it, but barely, and that assumed everything went perfectly. He thought about the collection notices in his desk drawer, the rationed medications, the careful calculations that governed every purchase. "I need time to think about it," Bill said quietly. "Mr. Anderson," Dr. Harper's voice was gentle but firm, "I need you to understand something. This condition is not stable. The growth is continuing, and there's increasing risk of rupture, infection, or worse. I strongly recommend we schedule surgery within the next 2 weeks." As they scheduled the follow-up appointments and MRI, Bill noticed Dr. Harper watching him with unusual intensity. There was something beyond professional concern in her gaze, a personal interest that felt familiar yet unplaceable. Walking to the car, Michael finally voiced his frustration. "Dad, you have the money. I saw it in your closet. Why are you hesitating?" Bill stopped walking and faced his son in the medical center parking lot. "That money represents 30 years of saving every penny I could. 30 years of buying store-brand groceries, wearing the same winter coat, driving a car held together with prayers and duct tape. If I spend it on surgery and then need long-term care, or if something else goes wrong medically, I'll have nothing. But if you don't have the surgery, you might die anyway. But at least I won't die poor and homeless." Bill's voice cracked with the weight of fears he'd carried alone for too long. "You don't understand what it's like to be old and alone, Michael. You have your career, your health insurance, your retirement accounts. I have a teacher's pension that barely covers utilities and a house that's falling apart." The drive home passed in heavy silence. That evening, while Bill rested, Michael made phone calls to financial advisors, to his own bank, to anyone who might help him understand his father's options. What he learned only deepened his guilt. Bill was right to be terrified. Long-term care costs averaged $60,000 annually. Medicare covered virtually none of it. His modest savings, accumulated through decades of careful living, would disappear in months if he needed assisted living. The surgery he needed to survive might leave him financially unable to afford recovery. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Martha Thompson arrived with a casserole and 3 other church ladies, all carrying covered dishes and determined expressions. "William Anderson," announced Dorothy Patterson, the church treasurer. "We need to talk." Bill tried to retreat to his bedroom, but the church ladies were having none of it. They'd organized what they called an intervention, though it felt more like a loving ambush. "The whole town's talking about what happened at the Medicare meeting," said Betty Whitman. "And we've decided we're not letting pride kill our favorite teacher." They'd done their research. Between them, they'd contacted every family whose children Bill had taught over his 40-year career. The response had been overwhelming. Former students, now adults with children of their own, wanted to help the man who'd shaped their early years. "We've started a fund," Dorothy announced, pulling out a notebook filled with pledges. "So far, we've raised $12,000, and that's just from people in town. When word gets out to all the families who moved away," Bill burst into tears. "I can't accept charity." "It's not charity," Martha said firmly. "It's gratitude. Do you have any idea how many children you've taught algebra? How many kids you helped through difficult times? Sarah Collins told me you bought her school supplies out of your own pocket when her father lost his job. Tommy Rodriguez said you stayed after school every day for months to help him pass geometry." The women had stories Bill had forgotten. Small kindnesses that had seemed natural at the time but had shaped young lives in lasting ways. Children from troubled homes who found safety in his classroom. Struggling students who discovered confidence through his patient teaching. Families going through divorce or financial hardship who found support in Bill's quiet care. "The way we see it," Betty continued, "you've been making deposits in this community for 40 years. Now it's time to make a withdrawal." The outpouring of support continued over the following days. Cards arrived from across the country. Former students who'd moved to California, Texas, Florida, all carrying memories of Mr. Anderson and checks to help with his medical expenses. A Facebook page started by one of his former students reached hundreds of people within days. Michael watched his father struggle with accepting help, understanding finally that his fierce independence wasn't pride but survival strategy. He'd learned to depend only on himself because depending on others felt too risky. Even depending on Michael had felt dangerous. What if he disappeared again? The breakthrough came when Dr. Harper called with Bill's MRI results. "Mr. Anderson, I need you to come in immediately. The imaging shows something unexpected that changes our surgical approach." Bill's blood turned cold. "Is it cancer?" "No, not cancer. But there appears to be a foreign object embedded within the cyst structure, something metallic. Do you have any memory of trauma to that area? Perhaps something that might have caused a foreign body to become embedded in the tissue?" Bill's hand went to his throat, and for a moment he couldn't speak. Michael watched his father's face drain of color, saw his hands begin to tremble. "Mr. Anderson, are you there?" "Yes," Bill whispered. "Yes, I'm here. Can you come in tomorrow morning? This finding significantly complicates the surgical planning, but it also means we need to proceed more urgently. The foreign object could be causing complications we hadn't anticipated." After hanging up, Bill sat motionless in Margaret's recliner. Michael had never seen his father look so fragile, so frightened. "Dad, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Bill turned to face his son, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of secrets he'd buried for decades. "Michael, there are things about my life, about our family, that I've never told you. Things I hoped would stay buried forever." He paused, gathering courage that felt decades overdue. "But if they're going to cut me open and if they're going to discover things, you need to know the truth." The confession that followed would change everything Michael thought he knew about his father, his family, and the man who'd raised him with such careful love and devastating secrets. "Before your mother, before Margaret, there was someone else. Someone I've spent 45 years trying to forget." Bill's voice cracked as he spoke the words that had been trapped in his throat for decades. "His name was Robert Kane, and I was married to him for 8 months in 1978. And Michael, honey, if they find what I think they're going to find inside that growth, some very old questions are going to need new answers." Bill's confession hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for decades. Michael sat frozen on Margaret's old ottoman, struggling to process the revelation that his father had been married before Margaret, that there was an entire chapter of his life Michael had never known existed. "Robert Kane," Bill repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was 29 when I met him. Young, naive, thought I was a confirmed bachelor who'd missed his chance at love. He was charming, successful, owned a small auto repair shop. Everyone in town thought I'd finally found myself a good man." Bill stood slowly from the recliner and walked to the window overlooking the backyard where Margaret's flower garden grew wild. "The marriage lasted 8 months. 8 months of hell that I've spent 45 years trying to forget." Michael found his voice. "What happened to him? To Robert?" Bill's hand went instinctively to his neck, fingers tracing the edge where the growth had taken residence. "He disappeared, June 15th, 1978. One day he was there, and the next morning he was gone." "Disappeared? How? Did he leave you? Did something happen to him?" The silence stretched so long Michael thought his father wouldn't answer. When Bill finally spoke, his words came out fractured, like pieces of a story he'd trained himself never to tell. "Robert had what people used to call a drinking problem. What we know now was alcoholism, but back then men were just considered hard drinkers. He'd come home mean, looking for fights, looking for reasons to—" Bill touched his neck again. "Looking for reasons to hurt me." Michael felt a cold understanding beginning to form. "Dad, did he hit you?" "Hit me, pushed me, threw things, called me names I wouldn't repeat to my worst enemy. But it was 1978, Michael. Domestic violence wasn't talked about the way it is now, especially not between men. Police would tell you to work it out at home, go to church, be a better spouse. I tried to leave twice, but he'd find me, charm his way back in, promise to change." Bill returned to his chair, but he couldn't sit still. His hands twisted together, and he kept touching his neck, adjusting an invisible collar, protecting whatever secret lay beneath. "The night he disappeared, we'd had the worst fight yet. I'd filed divorce papers without telling him. He found them in my briefcase." Bill's voice dropped to barely audible. "He came home drunk, angrier than I'd ever seen him. Started throwing things, screaming about how I thought I was too good for him, how I was trying to embarrass him in front of the whole town." Michael leaned forward, his heart racing. "What happened then?" "He had this ring, a gold signet ring that had belonged to his father. He'd given it to me when we got engaged, said it was a family heirloom. That night, when he was yelling, he grabbed it off my finger so hard he broke the skin. Then he—" Bill's voice broke completely. "Dad, it's okay. Take your time. He threw it at my head. Hard. The edge caught me right here. Bill pointed to where the growth now dominated his neck. Hit so hard I saw stars, blood everywhere. But that wasn't the worst part. Bill stood again, pacing now like a caged animal. I grabbed a baseball bat from the closet, just trying to defend myself. When he came at me again, I swung it. I didn't mean to hurt him badly. I just wanted him to stop. But he was drunk, unsteady, and when the bat connected with his temple, he fell backward. The room had grown cold, despite the October afternoon sun streaming through the windows. Michael realized he was holding his breath. He hit his head on the corner of the coffee table, made this awful sound like a watermelon dropping, and then he was just still. Michael felt the world tilt slightly. He was dead? I thought so. There was blood. He wasn't moving, wasn't breathing that I could tell. I was 29 years old, covered in my own blood, and the man who'd been terrorizing me for months was lying dead in my living room. Bill's voice had gone flat, emotionless, as if he was reciting someone else's story. What did you do? I panicked, completely panicked. I'd called the police twice before when he'd beaten me, and they'd done nothing. Told me marriage troubles should be worked out at home. Robert was well respected in town, had friends everywhere. I was just the math teacher he'd married. Who was going to believe me? Bill sat back down, his story pouring out now like water through a broken dam. I wrapped him in a tarp from his shop supplies and dragged him to his truck, drove out to the woods behind the old Miller property, where we used to go camping when we were dating, dug a grave with his own shovel and buried him there. Michael stared at his father, this man he thought he knew, trying to reconcile the gentle teacher who'd helped him with homework with someone capable of, "You buried him?" I buried him, drove his truck to the bus station 3 counties over, left it in the parking lot with the keys under the seat, made it look like he'd just left town. When people asked, I said he'd abandoned me, run off with someone else. Most folks believed it. Men leaving their wives wasn't uncommon. And you never told anyone? In 45 years? Bill's laugh was bitter. Who was I going to tell? By the time I met your mother 2 years later, I'd built an entire new life around the secret. Margaret was so kind, so gentle. She helped me heal from what she thought was just a bad divorce. How could I tell her I was a widower because I'd killed my first husband? Michael ran his hands through his hair, trying to process the magnitude of what his father had revealed. But, Dad, it sounds like self-defense. You were being abused. You were protecting yourself. That's not how it would have looked in 1978. Domestic violence between men wasn't even recognized. I would have been seen as a murderer, not a victim. My teaching career would have been over. I would have gone to prison. The weight of 45 years of secret keeping settled over the room like dust. Michael understood now why his father had become so isolated, why he'd seemed to carry an invisible burden Michael had never been able to identify. The ring, Michael said suddenly. You think the ring is what they found in the MRI? Bill nodded slowly. When Robert threw it at my head, it hit so hard it broke the skin deep. I remember pulling pieces of it out of the wound, but I was so panicked about everything else I didn't think about whether all of it came out. So I've been carrying a piece of evidence from that night for 45 years, a piece of Robert, a piece of that terrible night. And now they're going to cut me open and find it, and there are going to be questions I'm not sure I can answer anymore. Michael moved to sit beside his father on the couch, something he hadn't done since he was a child. Dad, times have changed. Laws have changed. What you described isn't murder, it's self-defense. Domestic violence is understood differently now. But Robert is still buried in those woods. That hasn't changed. And if they find that ring, if they start asking questions... Bill's voice trailed off as he contemplated possibilities that terrified him. We'll deal with it, Michael said, surprising himself with his certainty. "Whatever happens, we'll deal with it together. You've carried this alone for too long." Bill looked at his son, really looked at him for the first time in years. "You don't understand, Michael. If this comes out, it could destroy everything. Your reputation, your career with the FBI. Having a father who killed his first husband isn't exactly the kind of family history federal agents put on their security clearance forms. I don't care about any of that." Michael realized as he spoke that he meant it completely. "I care about you. I care about the fact that you've been living with this terror for my entire life. I care that you've been hiding from the world for 6 years because you're afraid of what doctors might discover." For the first time since his confession began, Bill allowed himself to cry. Not the careful, controlled tears he'd permitted himself over the years, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from decades of suppressed fear and guilt. "I never wanted you to know," he whispered between sobs. "I wanted to protect you from all of it. I thought if I could just keep the secret long enough, I'd die with it, and you'd never have to carry the burden of knowing what your father was capable of." Michael held his father while he cried, understanding finally why Bill had always seemed to be bracing for catastrophe, why he'd never quite allowed himself to fully relax into happiness, even during the good years with Margaret. When the tears finally subsided, Bill pulled back and looked at his son with eyes that seemed clearer than they'd been in years. "So what do we do now?" he asked. "Now we go to surgery," Michael said. "We let Dr. Harper do what she needs to do, and if the past comes back to haunt us, we face it together. You've been alone with this long enough." The morning of surgery arrived gray and cold, matching Bill's mood as he sat in the pre-operative waiting room at Regional Medical Center. Despite the community fundraising that had covered his medical expenses, despite Michael's unwavering support, he felt like he was walking toward his own execution. The ring, Robert's father's ring, was about to be removed from his body after 45 years, and with it, potentially the secret that had shaped his entire adult life. Dr. Elizabeth Harper appeared in scrubs, her professional demeanor masking what Bill sensed was personal concern beyond the typical doctor-patient relationship. There was something familiar about the way Dr. Harper looked at him, a recognition that went deeper than their previous appointments. "Mr. Anderson, we're ready for you. The surgical team is prepared, and we've planned for the complications the foreign object might present." "Doctor." Harper paused, studying Bill's face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Are you ready?" Bill nodded, though he felt anything but ready. Michael squeezed his hand as the nurses prepared to wheel him into the operating room. "I'll be right here when you wake up, Dad. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The operating room was blindingly white, filled with machines that beeped and hummed with technological precision. As the anesthesia mask covered his face, Bill's last conscious thought was a prayer he'd been afraid to pray for decades. "Please, let the truth finally set me free." Dr. Harper began the procedure with confident precision, her experienced hands navigating the complex anatomy of Bill's neck. The growth was larger than anticipated, and its blood supply more extensive. What should have been a 4-hour procedure stretched into the 6th hour as the surgical team carefully dissected layers of scar tissue that had built up around the foreign object. "There's something here," Dr. Harper announced to her team, her voice tight with concentration. "Metallic, as we expected, but there's more complexity to it than the imaging suggested." The surgical resident assisting her leaned in for a better view. What kind of object could be embedded this deeply and maintain this level of tissue reaction for decades? Dr. Harper carefully extracted what appeared to be a gold signet ring, tarnished and partially corroded by decades of body chemistry, but still recognizable. The surgical team fell silent as she placed it in a specimen container, the weight of the moment settling over the room like a shroud. But that wasn't all. Embedded deeper, they found fragments of what appeared to be bone, small pieces that had somehow worked their way into the tissue over the years, creating the inflammatory response that had grown into the massive tumor. In 35 years of surgery, I've never seen anything like this, Doctor, Harper murmured, her voice barely audible above the hum of machines. These objects have been here for decades. The tissue response suggests initial trauma, then gradual encapsulation. The surgical resident, Dr. James Chen, studied the extracted materials with fascination tinged by unease. The patient would have had to sustain significant trauma for objects to be embedded this deeply. Was there any history of accident or assault in his records? Dr. Harper paused in her suturing, her mind racing. Something about Bill Anderson had been nagging at her since their first meeting. The name, the age, the location, the timeline. Pieces of a puzzle she'd been unconsciously assembling were suddenly clicking into place. "Dr. Harper," the anesthesiologist called out, his voice sharp with concern. "Patient's blood pressure is dropping. Heart rate's becoming irregular." Bill was fighting the anesthesia, his body responding to some deep psychological trauma even while unconscious. His vitals fluctuated wildly, as if he was reliving the events that had placed these objects in his body 45 years ago. "He's experiencing some kind of stress response," Dr. Harper observed, working quickly to complete the surgery while monitoring Bill's vital signs. "Increase the sedation slightly, but keep him stable." As Dr. Harper sutured the final layers of tissue, Bill began speaking under anesthesia, fragmented words that made the surgical team exchange glances. "Don't tell Margaret. Robert is gone. Had to stop him. The ring. So much blood." Dr. Harper's hands stilled for a moment. Robert. The name triggered a memory she'd been struggling to access since meeting Bill. Robert Kane, her uncle, the uncle who had abandoned her family when she was 3 years old, disappearing without explanation in 1978. The realization hit Dr. Harper like electricity coursing through her veins. Bill Anderson wasn't just a patient. He was connected to the central mystery of her childhood, the question that had haunted her family for decades. Her uncle hadn't abandoned them. Something had happened to him. Something that involved this man lying unconscious on her operating table. "Dr. Harper?" Dr. Chen noticed her pause, concern creeping into his voice. "Are you all right?" "Yes, I'm fine. Let's finish this procedure." But Patricia's mind was reeling. The timeline matched perfectly. Her uncle's disappearance in 1978, Bill's obvious trauma, the objects embedded in his neck. Pieces of a story that had haunted her entire life were suddenly coming together in the most unexpected way possible. Bill's surgery concluded successfully, with all foreign objects removed and the growth completely excised. The tissue samples were sent for pathological analysis, and the extracted ring and bone fragments were documented as evidence of historical trauma. But for Dr. Harper, the medical procedure had raised more questions than it had answered. As Bill was moved to recovery, Dr. Harper found herself staring at the ring in its specimen container. She had seen this piece of jewelry before, in old family photographs her grandmother had shown her. This was her grandfather's ring, the one her Uncle Robert had inherited when his father died in 1975. The implications were staggering. If Bill Anderson had this ring embedded in his neck, if he had sustained trauma involving bone fragments on the same timeline as Robert Kane's disappearance, then Dr. Harper was looking at evidence of what might have been her uncle's final moments. Dr. Harper stepped into the hallway and called her Aunt Rose, now 87 and living in a nursing home 3 hours away. "Aunt Rose, it's Elizabeth. I need to ask you about Uncle Robert. Do you remember the ring Dad gave him? The one that belonged to Grandpa?" Her aunt's voice was clear despite her age. "Of course, dear. Beautiful piece, gold with the family crest engraved." Robert said he was going to give it to that teacher he married, William something. Why do you ask after all these years? Aunt Rose, what do you remember about William? About Uncle Robert's disappearance? Such a sweet boy, that William. So sad what Robert put him through. Your uncle was drinking heavily those last months, coming home angry, mean as a snake. Robert always had his father's temper, but the alcohol made it worse. Rose paused, her voice growing smaller. The last time I saw them together, William had bruises on his arms, made excuses about falling downstairs, but I knew better. I tried to talk to Robert about it, but he wouldn't listen. Dr. Harper felt her world shifting beneath her feet. Did you ever suspect that Robert didn't just leave town? Honey, I always wondered. Robert was many things. A drunk, a mean husband, but he wasn't the type to just disappear. He was too proud, too rooted in that community. When he vanished, I figured something bad had happened, but the police weren't interested in investigating a man who just abandoned his spouse. They had better things to do than chase after what they called domestic troubles. After ending the call, Dr. Harper stood in the hospital corridor, grappling with the possibility that she had just operated on the man who might have killed her uncle. But strangely, she felt no anger, only a complex mixture of understanding and relief. Her uncle hadn't abandoned her family. He had been stopped by someone defending himself against Robert's violence. Bill began waking from anesthesia as the afternoon sun slanted through his recovery room windows. Michael was at his bedside holding his hand as he emerged from the medicated fog that had protected him from 45 years of buried trauma. "The surgery went well, Dad," Michael said softly, his voice thick with emotion and exhaustion. "Dr. Harper removed everything. You're going to be fine." Bill's hand went instinctively to his neck, feeling the bandages where the growth had been. For the first time in 6 years, the left side of his neck felt normal, unencumbered by the secret he'd been carrying. The weight that had pressed against his spine for decades was finally gone. "Did they find—" Bill's voice was hoarse from the breathing tube. "They found it," Michael confirmed, his voice carefully neutral. "A ring and some other pieces. Dr. Harper has everything documented." Bill closed his eyes, feeling a mixture of terror and relief washing over him in waves. The evidence was out of his body, out in the world where it could be examined, questioned, potentially traced back to that terrible night in 1978. But for the first time in 45 years, he also felt something he'd almost forgotten: the possibility of freedom. "What happens now?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the quiet hum of medical equipment. Before Michael could answer, there was a soft knock on the recovery room door. Dr. Harper entered, still in her surgical scrubs, carrying herself with the careful composure of someone who had just made a life-altering discovery. "Mr. Anderson, how are you feeling?" "Like I've been carrying a weight I can finally put down," Bill answered honestly, his voice stronger than it had been in years. Dr. Harper pulled up a chair beside the bed, her movements deliberate and measured. "Mr. Anderson, I need to talk to you about what we found during surgery. But more than that, I need to talk to you about my uncle. About Robert Kane." The words, "my uncle Robert Kane," hung in the recovery room air like a thunderclap. Bill's heart monitor began beeping rapidly as his blood pressure spiked, and Michael instinctively moved closer to his father's bedside, sensing that their world was about to shift once again in ways they couldn't have imagined. Dr. Elizabeth Harper sat perfectly still, her professional composure masking the emotional earthquake happening beneath the surface. "Mr. Anderson, I believe you knew my uncle as your first husband. Robert Kane disappeared in June 1978 when I was 3 years old. I've spent my entire life wondering what happened to him." Bill's face went ashen against the white hospital pillows. He stared at Dr. Harper with growing recognition. seeing now what had been nagging at his subconscious during their previous meetings. The shape of the eyes, the stubborn set of the jaw, even the way she held her head when concentrating, all unmistakably familiar. "You're Robert's niece," Bill whispered, his voice barely audible above the steady beep of monitors. "Little Elizabeth from the family photos. You were just a baby when—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would acknowledge what had happened to her uncle. "You remember me?" Dr. Harper's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing the vulnerable child who had grown up with questions that had never been answered. Bill nodded slowly, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "Robert talked about you sometimes, especially when he'd been drinking. He'd show me pictures of his sweet little niece Elizabeth and talk about how you were the only good thing in his family. He said—" Bill's voice caught. "He said he wanted to be better for you, to be the kind of uncle you could be proud of." Michael looked between the two adults, struggling to process the implications of this impossible coincidence. His father's surgeon was the niece of the man his father had killed in self-defense 45 years ago. Dr. Harper leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mr. Anderson, I need to know the truth about what happened to my uncle. The ring we removed from your neck, it belonged to my grandfather. Robert inherited it when Grandpa died. How did it end up embedded in your tissue for 45 years? The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Bill looked at Michael, then at Elizabeth, seeing in the surgeon's face the same earnest expression that little Elizabeth had worn in the family photographs Robert had shown him during their brief, troubled marriage. "Elizabeth, honey," Bill began, his voice trembling with the weight of decades-old trauma. "What do you remember about your uncle? What did your family tell you about him?" "Very little. I was only 3 when he disappeared, but my Aunt Rose told me stories over the years. She said he was troubled, that he drank too much, that he had a temper like my grandfather." Elizabeth paused, studying Bill's reaction carefully. "She also said that after he married you, he seemed to get worse, not better. She was worried about you." Bill felt the weight of 45 years of secret keeping pressing down on his chest like a physical force. "Your aunt was right. Robert was— he was not well. The drinking made him angry, violent. He would—" Bill touched the bandaged area of his neck unconsciously. "He hurt me. Many times." "He abused you," Elizabeth said, not as a question but as a statement of medical fact, her training allowing her to recognize the patterns even decades later. "Yes, for months. I tried to leave twice, but he always found me, always convinced me to come back, promised he'd change, that he'd get help. But it only got worse." Elizabeth felt her medical training take over, analyzing the trauma pattern with clinical detachment, even as her personal emotions churned. "The force would have had to be significant to embed the ring that deeply into tissue. You said he threw it at you?" "The night he disappeared, we'd had the worst fight yet. I'd filed for divorce papers without telling him, and he found them in my briefcase." Bill's voice grew stronger as he spoke, as if confession was giving him courage he'd forgotten he possessed. "He came home drunk and enraged. He grabbed the ring from my finger, breaking the skin, cutting me. Then he threw it at my head with all the force he could muster." Elizabeth processed this information with the analytical mind of a surgeon while grappling with the emotional complexity of learning that her former patient had killed her uncle in what was clearly self-defense. "The ring hit hard enough to embed fragments deep into the tissue," she observed clinically. "But that wasn't what killed him, was it?" Bill looked directly at Elizabeth now, preparing to tell Robert's niece what had really happened to her uncle. "When I tried to defend myself, I grabbed a baseball bat from our bedroom closet. When he came at me again, screaming that he was going to kill me, I swung it at him." Bill's voice broke as he continued. "He was drunk, unsteady on his feet. When the bat connected with his temple, he fell backward and struck his head on the corner of our coffee table. There was so much blood and he wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. Elizabeth sat in stunned silence, processing not just the information but the emotional complexity of learning that her childhood mystery had such a tragic and complicated resolution. "I was 29 years old, terrified, and I panicked," Bill continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'd called the police on Robert twice before when he'd beaten me, and they'd done nothing, told me it was a domestic matter that I should try to work things out. Robert was well respected in town, and I was just the math teacher. Who would have believed me?" Michael watched Dr. Harper's face for signs of anger or judgment, but saw only professional curiosity mixed with what appeared to be relief rather than condemnation. "So, you buried him," Elizabeth said quietly, her voice neither accusatory nor judgmental. Bill nodded, shame washing over him anew. "In the woods behind the old Miller property. I wrapped him in a tarp, put him in his truck, and drove out there, dug a grave and buried him, then drove his truck to the bus station 3 counties over and left it there to make it look like he'd abandoned us both." The recovery room fell silent except for the steady beeping of Bill's monitors. Elizabeth stared at her hands, processing the revelation that had answered a lifelong question in the most unexpected way possible. "Dr. Harper," Michael said carefully, his FBI training kicking in despite the personal nature of the situation, "what does this mean legally? I mean for my father?" Elizabeth looked up, her expression thoughtful rather than accusatory. "Mr. Anderson, I need you both to understand something. I became a surgeon partly because I wanted to help people heal from trauma. I've seen hundreds of domestic violence cases over the years, and I understand the dynamics in ways that weren't understood in 1978. She stood and walked to the window, gathering her thoughts while looking out at the parking lot where families came and went, dealing with their own medical crises. "What your father described sounds like textbook self-defense during a domestic violence assault. The pattern of previous abuse, the escalation, the victim's fear for his life, these are all factors that courts recognize today but didn't understand 45 years ago." Bill felt a flutter of hope mixed with terror. "But I buried the body. I hid evidence. I lied to police when they asked about Robert's disappearance. You were a traumatized abuse victim who had no faith in the system's ability to protect you," Elizabeth replied, turning back to face them both. "And based on what my aunt told me about how domestic violence was handled in 1978, especially between men, your fear was probably justified." Elizabeth returned to her chair, looking directly at Bill with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Mr. Anderson, I need to tell you something. I've wondered my entire life what happened to my uncle. Part of me hoped he was alive somewhere, that maybe he'd come back someday and explain why he left us. But another part of me, the part that remembered my aunt's careful words about his drinking and his temper, suspected something terrible had happened." Bill searched Elizabeth's face for signs of hatred or condemnation, but found neither. Instead, he saw something he hadn't expected, understanding and perhaps even compassion. "When I was in medical school," Elizabeth continued, "I specialized in trauma surgery partly because I wanted to help people who'd been hurt the way my aunt hinted that you had been hurt. I've treated dozens of domestic violence victims, and I know what that kind of terror looks like. I know what desperation can drive people to do." Michael found his voice, barely believing what he was hearing. "Are you saying you're not going to report this to police?" Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, weighing her medical ethics against her personal understanding of justice and the complicated realities of domestic violence. "I'm saying that as a physician, my primary obligation is to my patient's well-being. Mr. Anderson has carried this trauma for 45 years. He suffered enough." Bill began crying again, but these were tears of relief rather than fear. "Elizabeth, I am so sorry. I know that doesn't change anything, doesn't bring your uncle back, but I am truly sorry for what happened and for what it cost your family." Elizabeth moved closer to Bill's bed, her voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Anderson, do you remember what you used to teach us in math class about problem solving? You said that sometimes the hardest problems require us to find a different approach, to look at the situation from a new angle. Bill nodded, remembering those classroom discussions about persistence and creative thinking. I forgave my uncle years ago for abandoning our family, Elizabeth continued. Now I understand he didn't abandon us. He was stopped by someone defending himself against Robert's violence. In a strange way, that's easier to forgive than abandonment. And you, she paused, choosing her words carefully. You've spent 45 years making amends through your teaching, through the lives you've touched and improved. That has to count for something. The three of them sat in the growing afternoon shadows, processing the weight of secrets revealed and burdens shared. The room felt different somehow, as if the air itself had been cleared of something toxic that had been poisoning it for decades. "What happens now?" Bill asked finally, his voice stronger than it had been since before the surgery. Elizabeth considered the question carefully, understanding that her answer would shape the rest of all their lives. "Now, you heal from surgery. The tissue samples will show chronic inflammation consistent with old trauma. The ring and bone fragments will be documented as foreign objects removed during a medical procedure." She paused, then added with quiet conviction, "As for the other matter, that's between us. My uncle's case was closed decades ago as a missing person. There's no active investigation, no one looking for answers except me, and I have my answer now." Bill reached out and took Elizabeth's hand, the gesture spanning decades and bridging the gap between victim and family member, between past and present. "You saved my life today," Bill said, his voice thick with emotion, "just like I tried to save my own life 45 years ago." Elizabeth squeezed Bill's hand, understanding finally why she had felt drawn to trauma surgery, why she had always felt compelled to help the wounded and broken. "We saved each other," she replied softly. "And maybe that's how healing really works, not by forgetting the past, but by transforming it into something that can help others survive." 6 months after surgery, Bill Anderson stood in front of his bedroom mirror for the first time in decades without immediately turning away. The surgical scar on his neck had healed to a thin pink line, barely visible unless someone looked closely. More importantly, the weight he'd carried, both physical and emotional, was finally gone. The transformation went far deeper than his appearance. For the first time since 1978, Bill slept through the night without nightmares. He ate meals at his kitchen table instead of standing at the counter, afraid to sit still long enough for thoughts to catch up with him. Most remarkably, he had begun to laugh again, genuine, spontaneous laughter that surprised even him. Michael had kept his promise to face the future together. He'd taken extended leave from the FBI and moved back to Maple Grove permanently, purchasing the house next door to his father. What had begun as temporary caregiving had evolved into something neither of them had expected, a genuine friendship between two adults who were finally getting to know each other. "I'm thinking about opening a consulting practice here," Michael told his father one morning over breakfast, the ritual they'd established of sharing coffee and conversation every day. "Small towns need security assessments too, and I'm tired of chasing federal cases that never seem to end." Bill smiled, recognizing the boy who used to build elaborate detective scenarios with action figures in the same kitchen where they now shared their mornings. "Your mother would be so proud. She always said you had the gift of seeing what could be, not just what was." The reference to Margaret no longer carried the undertone of guilt that had shadowed Bill's memories for decades. He could speak of his late wife with pure love now, unburdened by the secret that had made him feel unworthy of her affection. Dr. Elizabeth Harper had become a regular presence in Bill's life. Though their relationship had evolved far beyond doctor and patient, she visited monthly, ostensibly for medical follow-ups, but increasingly they spent their time talking about healing, about the strange circularity of their connected lives, and about the family they'd both lost and found. During one visit, Elizabeth brought a small velvet box from her purse. "I thought you might like to see this," she said, settling onto Bill's sofa with the careful respect one shows precious artifacts. Inside was Robert's ring, cleaned and polished to its original luster. "My Aunt Rose wanted you to have it back. She said it belongs with someone who understands its full story." Bill held the ring carefully, no longer afraid of the memories it carried. "It's beautiful. I'd forgotten how it looked when it was new." He turned it over in his hands, examining the family crest that had once meant hope for a new beginning. "What should I do with it?" "Whatever feels right to you," Elizabeth replied. "Aunt Rose suggested we might bury it with Uncle Robert when we finally lay him to rest properly." The mention of Robert's burial led to a conversation that had been building for months. Elizabeth had used her connections to quietly arrange for the recovery of Robert's remains from the woods behind the old Miller property. The process had been handled discreetly, without legal complications, allowing the family to finally have closure. "I'd like to attend the service," Bill said quietly. "If your family would be comfortable with that. I need to say goodbye properly." The funeral service for Robert Kane was held on a crisp October morning, 45 years after his death. It was a small gathering. Elizabeth and her family, Aunt Rose in her wheelchair, a few distant relatives who remembered Robert before the drinking took hold. And Bill, standing slightly apart but welcomed by Elizabeth's gentle insistence. Pastor Williams from Bill's church conducted the service, speaking about redemption, forgiveness, and the complicated nature of human relationships. "We gather not to judge the past, but to find peace in the present," he said, his words carrying special meaning for everyone present. As they lowered the simple casket into the ground, Bill stepped forward and placed Robert's ring on top. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words he'd carried for 45 years finally spoken aloud. "I'm sorry it ended that way. I hope you found peace." Elizabeth stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly, "for giving us answers, for giving him dignity in death, for surviving when survival seemed impossible." The healing continued in unexpected ways. Bill's story, shared carefully and with Elizabeth's support, became a powerful tool for helping other domestic violence survivors. The local women's shelter invited him to speak, and his message resonated deeply with audiences who had never heard a male survivor's perspective. "Staying alive and staying safe are more important than staying quiet," Bill would tell groups of women and men, many young enough to be his grandchildren. "I carried shame for 45 years, thinking that protecting myself made me a murderer. But I learned that sometimes survival requires actions we never thought we'd be capable of. The measure of our worth isn't in the terrible things that happen to us. It's in how we choose to heal and help others heal." His talks drew standing ovations, but more importantly, they drew people who approached him afterward with their own stories of abuse, their own fears about leaving dangerous situations. Bill began volunteering as a counselor, his decades of teaching experience translating naturally to helping traumatized individuals find their voices and their strength. Michael watched his father's transformation with amazement and pride. The man who had spent years hiding from the world was now traveling throughout Minnesota and neighboring states, speaking to audiences of hundreds about courage and survival. "You know what's funny?" Bill said one evening as they drove home from a particularly moving presentation at a college campus. "I spent 45 years thinking I was running from my past, but I was actually running toward my purpose. Every student I taught, every difficult situation I helped a family navigate, It was all preparation for this. The most meaningful recognition came when the current principal of Maple Grove High School contacted Bill to announce that the school board had voted unanimously to name the new counseling center in his honor. The William Anderson Center for Student Support would focus on creating safe spaces for students facing challenges at home. At the dedication ceremony, attended by hundreds of former students spanning 4 decades, Bill stood before the crowd that had known him only as their beloved math teacher. Now they knew him as something more complex and more inspiring, a survivor who had chosen courage over comfort, truth over silence, and service over self-protection. 45 years ago, Bill told the gathered crowd, his voice strong and clear, I made a choice to protect myself from violence. Today, I make a choice to protect others by sharing my story. Both choices required courage I didn't know I possessed. But here's what I've learned. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's teaching others to be brave by showing them what survival looks like. Elizabeth sat in the front row with her family, watching the man who had inadvertently shaped her life's calling, now teaching an entire community about resilience and redemption. In her purse, she carried a letter from Aunt Rose expressing gratitude that Robert's story had finally found an ending that honored both the victim and the family left behind. As Bill concluded his speech, he looked out over the faces of people whose lives he had touched as a teacher, a survivor, and now as an advocate. He thought about the scared young man who had buried a secret in the woods 45 years ago, never imagining that one day he would stand before hundreds of people, unashamed and unafraid. The secret that had nearly killed him had also saved him, leading him to exactly where and who he was meant to be. Sometimes, Bill realized, the heaviest burdens we carry become the very foundations upon which we build our greatest contributions to the world. In the end, love had indeed conquered all. Not romantic love, but the deeper love of community, forgiveness, and the courage to transform pain into purpose. Bill's story reminds us that the secrets we carry to protect ourselves often become the very chains that imprison us. At 74, he discovered that the shame he'd hidden for 45 years wasn't his burden to bear alone. It was his strength to share with others. How many of us have spent decades believing that our past mistakes, our survival choices, or our moments of human frailty define our worth? Bill thought protecting himself from an abusive spouse made him unworthy of love, undeserving of peace. He lived as a prisoner in his own home, hiding from a world that actually needed his wisdom. But when he finally found the courage to speak his truth, he discovered something powerful. Our deepest wounds can become our greatest gifts to others. The very experiences that made him feel broken were exactly what other people needed to hear to find their own strength. At any stage of life, we can choose to stop hiding from our stories and start using them to heal ourselves and others. Your past doesn't disqualify you from happiness. It qualifies you to help others find theirs. What secret have you been carrying that might actually be someone else's lifeline? When did you last choose courage over comfort, and how did it change your life? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story matters more than you know.